YouTube, Captain Machine here, back for another review, and today we're talking about a much requested board game which I've only recently had the joy of playing, and that is Descent Journey in the Dark, which is produced by Fantasy Flight Games. And before I actually start talking about this particular game, I'm going to go through a bit of history because I think it is relevant, although Fantasy Flight may disagree with me. Back in 1989, my eyes were open to the world of gaming, or at least fantasy role-playing gaming, things like that, on account that Milton Bradley and Games Workshop formed a pact and decided to release a game called Hero Quest, which is a fantastic board game, and which introduced the ideas of combat, dungeon exploration, fighting monsters, gathering treasure, magic items, warriors, wizards, and things like that. A fantastic game with a fantastic marketing campaign, which I've not seen repeated to this day for anywhere near a good product. It did spawn many offshoots for the partnership in the forms of Space Crusade, Advanced Heroes Quest, and the absolutely terrible Advanced Space Crusade. There is a fifth game in the series that they did, which was a massive war game on was done on like a little vinyl mat. And it was all hex-based with these regiments, although the name escapes me and I can't Google it, so I'm sorry I can't mention that, but it is a very obscure game, so I would forgive you for not knowing about it. Basically, Descent borrows heavily from that, in my honest opinion. It's all about going into dungeons with lovely card cutouts, card stock dungeons, much like Advanced Hero Quest used, because Advanced Hero Quest got rid of the solid board that Hero Quest had and gave us modular units, modular corridors, modular rooms, doors to put between them, and so on and so forth. And Descent does this as well. And basically the idea is that the Dungeon Master would lay out the dungeon and you would explore it, and as you explore it, predetermined monsters would appear in certain places in certain rooms. You even have little box text as well to read out to your players to give them a bit of a feel for where they are. And from there it sounds pretty normal, perhaps like a simple run-of-the-mill board game, and if it had just been that, it would have been quite boring. It would have been entertaining for a short period of time, but after all it would have got boring very quick. However, it quickly becomes a game of us versus them, or at least the players versus Dungeon Master, because you're trying to basically defeat the dungeon before the dungeon defeats you. You do get resurrected if you die in this, it does happen, and there's not much, in some respects, due to poor luck or to very careful planning by the Dungeon Master, you are going to die. And the knock-on effect of that is that you will lose conquest points, which, when you hit 0, means you've lost the game. So and the more powerful your hero is, the more it costs to resurrect them. So there is that way of determining if you can lose, given the fact that you can resurrect yourself. It's absolutely amazing game, also in the fact that it basically plays on the card element that is common in a lot of board games these days. You'll have a deck of cards to play from, at least the Dungeon Master does. And from there, he will draw traps, monsters, and events, and he'll spend his allotted resource, I can't remember what the actual terminology is, to activate these abilities. Obviously, the more dangerous the ability, the more resources it takes from him, and he has to wait for that to recuperate over time. So you're constantly being besieged by monsters and traps. As you're going through the dungeon, you can't really take a breather from it. In fact, if you lose sight of a particular place, like say for example you go around a corridor, go around a corner of the corridor and go into the next room, and you can't see the original room you started out in anymore, then the GM is well within his rights to start spawning monsters in that room and have them come around and chase you around. So you are constantly being besieged by these creatures, and it makes for a very tense and very interesting game. I seem to remember when we played it, I've only played one game so far, with the original box set, we didn't use any of the expansions, which there are many of. It was a very tense game. Even just the first dungeon was very tense. I mean, we got some nasty combos in terms of our magic items that allow us to do a lot of damage very quickly. But at the end of the day, we're still mortal people, and we still really can't take on massive waves of individuals and massive wave of monsters. You know, be them giants, spiders, bats, goblins, hellhounds, you name it, it's in there. There's dragons as well. And it's a very, very entertaining game. Now, there are some downsides to this, and there are very minor downsides, but for some people they are big ones. Regrettably, as with all Fantasy Flight products, I've got a copy of Arkham Horror and the World of Warcraft board game up there. So I know this from personal experience, and also if you collect Dark Heresy, Road Trader, or the new Deathwatch when it's coming out, you'll also know it from this expansion as well. Fantasy Flight likes to charge for their stuff. They charge a lot of money. Granted, you could argue quite easily that with all the plastic models you get in the box, all the nice cardstock counters and the board itself, you are easily getting your money's worth. However, at £60 sterling, and whatever that is in dollars, it's a lot of money, an awful lot of money for a board game, which when you're replicating something like Hero Quest that came back out in the 1989 onwards, 1990s in America, was like $20. It's a massive increase. Granted, you could argue that's inflation playing a part, but it's a very expensive game to buy, and if you want to get the expansion packs, be prepared to shell out because they're expensive as well. That's my only downside, my only gripe about this game. The game plays fantastically. I do highly recommend it if you can get your hands on it, and you can afford it, then give it a whirl. Best bet, in my honest opinion, is if you've got a nice stable group that like to get together and game on a regular basis, then all chip in and get it between yourselves. Although be warned, this is not a pick up and play game that you can easily run half an hour to an hour before your actual role playing game starts. This is an all-nighter, and there's even an expansion which not only expands upon the original material and the other adventures and the other expansions, it also gives you this massive epic campaign to play through, where you not only do you level up, but your monsters level up and the bad guys level up, and so on and so forth. There's a little mini industry that's popped up around this, from buying metal figures for the various people painting the figures. There's galleries out there to look at, people that have painted their figures for Descent and done fantastic jobs for it too. So I'm going to cut it short and say that overall I give this a solid 4 out of 5. It's a long game, but most decent games are, in my opinion, especially when you've got a nice in-depth game like this. The only reason why it's not a 5 out of 5 is purely the prohibitive cost. It's a very expensive game. Now, I know this is the going price for board games these days, but it's not going to stop me crying about it, because the honest truth is that there are games out there that are much cheaper. Granted, they may not have as many little nice bits in them, but Fantasy Flight, in my honest opinion, does enjoy charging more than is comfortable, or more, at least more than the industry standard for certain products, and this is no exception. But it's their workhorse. It's one of the products which sells an absolute bucket load for the company. I wish you the best luck, and it looks like they're still making expansions for it, they're still releasing models for it, and there's still a massive fan base out there that really enjoys this game, and if you play it, you might become one of those guys too. Thank you for your time, guys. Goodbye.